Hello and welcome to the Mostly Stable Podcast. I'm your host, Travis Hutton. I'm a firefighter paramedic in the Pacific Northwest who is mostly stable. Any case presented in the show has been changed to protect patient privacy. Any references will be listed in the show notes. Any views expressed are that of my own and do not reflect the views of my employer or any governing or licensing body. And remember, always follow your local protocols. All right, we are back on the podcast, and my cat is behaving in a manner that somebody on methamphetamine would behave. So if you hear some meowing, tromping around, or if he jumps up on the desk and assault me, don't be surprised. I want to start today's episode with our first listener question. Somebody asked what the difference between a single-blind randomized control trial and a double-blind randomized control trial was. And I think that's a great question. So a double-blind is the clinician and the patients, the participants. They don't know whether they're getting a placebo or whether they're getting the experimental treatment or whether they're getting the control group, which is the current treatment. Depends on what kind of study you're doing and how it's conducted. But a single blind study is when only one party doesn't know whether they're getting the placebo or the treatment. So sometimes that's the researcher and sometimes that's the participant. Usually speaking, it is going to be the researcher that knows which one is which. And the main difference between the two as far as like accuracy is concerned is that a double-blind study is less prone to bias from the researcher. Okay, as far as topics today, we're going to be talking about a call that I had a couple weeks ago that put me in some pretty austere conditions for the environment that I'm usually working in. This is have you ever had those days where you're joking about a certain type of call in the morning and then it actually happens later that day? So we get to work around 8 and the crew is joking, we haven't had this specific type of call in a while and it would be really crazy if one happened right now, because it was also the scenario that the interviewee looking to work at this agency was going to have to be put through that day as well. So we were joking about how crazy it would be if it were happening right now. And we're like, oh, yeah, we can take the interviewee along as a ride along and see how they would do. Jokingly, of course. And so here's the call. We are dispatched to a motocross track for a BLS accident. The notes simply state that the patient is alert and talking and is complaining of leg pain. We go en route and we have 3 people. We have myself and an EMT on a medic unit, and then somebody is following behind in a pickup truck. A couple of volunteers are responding to the station from home as well, and they will arrive on scene shortly after we will. We arrive on scene and we're guided in by someone on a motorcycle, not wearing a helmet. Don't get me started about not wearing your helmet when riding a motorcycle. You know better, guy. Anyways, we're guided in and we're directed to the patient, who is between these 2 berms or jumps, and he is quite far down into this pit. My cat is being a crackhead. All right. So anyways, the patient is in this pretty big pit, and so we grab all of our kits. We can't get the ambulance near him. He's probably a good 100-yard walk down a pretty steep hill, steep, dusty, not good footing. There's deep ruts and quad tracks and motorcycle tracks throughout. But we take all of our kits down there and our spine board and our trauma bag, and I start to assess him. I walk up to him, and he is laying there with his head propped up on his helmet, and he just says, "Hey, what's up?" I was like, "Hey, I'm Travis. I'm a paramedic from the fire department. How you feeling?" He goes, "Meh, I think my legs are broken." And I looked down, and I noticed this when I walked up, but I looked down, and his legs, starting about the mid-shaft femur, turn into a bowl of spaghetti noodles. I can't tell which is his left foot and which is his right foot and which direction they are supposed to be pointing. And this guy's just sitting there. He's chilling. He's not in any pain. He goes, "They're starting to hurt a little bit." And I was like, "Just a little, huh? Okay, just a little." Anyways, we get a set of vitals on him. I do a full head-to-toe assessment and find that the legs are pretty much the only injury. Some minor scrapes to his elbows, but no chest trauma, no loss of consciousness. He remembers the whole thing. He came up over the jump and then lost control of the bike, and the bike betrayed him for it. But anyways, come to the time now. It's time to move him. I let the new EMT IV tech try and start a line, and he misses. And that's not his fault, and I'm not blaming him for that. But he misses the IV, and I have to go get it. Not a big deal. Not really a big deal at all. Should I have let him try an IV on this patient? Probably not. Probably not the most appropriate choice for myself. But the guy seemed stable at first. Vital signs are like a blood pressure of 130/86, heart rate of like 75. Really didn't paint too critical of a clinical picture. The next hurdle that we're going over is, how do we get this guy out of the hole? And the only vehicle we can get down to him is a pickup truck. So one of the volunteers is driving the pickup truck down to us, and the other volunteer is setting up a landing zone for Lifeline. Lifeline was called for early. I activated them early, and I launched them early. So now it's time to try and get the guy out. Because the IV was delayed, I gave him a dose of intramuscular ketamine at 0.25 milligrams per kilogram. And then once the IV was established, we hung a bag of fluids, and I gave him 0.25 bumps of ketamine until I got the desired effect. The total dose he got ended up being 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. I really wanted him sedated for the move because I was going to have to heavily manipulate his legs to even get him to fit on a backboard and into the back of this pickup truck, where we would then be bouncing over rough terrain to get to the landing zone. Now, some things I want to talk about with ketamine. I've got the NIH guidelines for procedural sedation pulled up. They will be linked in the show notes. But some of the adverse effects you can expect to experience with ketamine, now we choose it. Typically, we choose ketamine for its catecholamine promoting effects, right? So it's going to raise their blood pressure, raise their heart rate a little bit. It's going to maintain those. It's also not as much of a respiratory depressant as other sedative techniques. So say fentanyl and midazolam, your main concern is that you're going to have a dump in blood pressure, dump in respiratory drive. But ketamine kind of keeps those things intact. But it does that sometimes. An adverse effect of ketamine can be a respiratory depressive side effect, especially if it's given too fast. And something I did not do is drip it in. These were boluses, and everybody knows that when you're bolusing a medication that it's supposed to be slow IV push over 1 to 2 minutes. It never really is 1 to 2 minutes. You get to the end of your flush and you're like, oh shit, it's only been like 45 seconds, right? So that's one potential side effect. The other potential side effects are like laryngospasm, that's super rare, and then nausea and vomiting. So we sedate him, we move him to the backboard, we secure him, and we put him in the back of this pickup truck. And we're continuing to monitor him all the way to the landing zone, and we hand off patient care. And he starts to have a little bit of an emergence reaction. That's another side effect. Emergence reactions, they can be varied from pretty mild to pretty bad. And so then we hand off to the life flight providers. They take off, and I get follow-up later that he had bilateral, just shattered legs. He went straight into surgery. He recovered, and I don't know what happened to him after that. But he is alive. He is alive. Now, why did I choose ketamine? Now, especially when you have patients that are going to need a lot of movement and a lot of manipulation of their broken extremities, I really don't want him feeling it, and I honestly really don't want him remembering that it happened in the first place, to be honest. So I chose ketamine because it has sedation effects, it has amnesia effects, and it also has analgesic effects. So it kind of is like a wonder drug for this situation. And keeping in mind that the side effects, I set it up almost kind of like it was an RSI situation. So I had my airway kit ready and handy. The laryngoscope was ready to go. End-tidal capnography, blood pressure cycling every 5 minutes, and setting it up just like an RSI. The one thing I did not do, and that I should have done, is pre-oxygenate. So instead of relying only on the bag valve mask to support his ventilations, I should have just had an under-breather on him from the get-go. That would have probably helped a whole lot. Because one major downfall of what happened on this call was once we got him in the back of the pickup truck and that emergence reaction started happening, he did start having some of that respiratory depression side effect. And since it was under the beating sun in the middle of July, it was really kind of hard to monitor those respirations and then keep a good eye on him. So I just threw a non-breather or a bag valve mask on him and kind of supported those ventilations. But what probably would have been better was to have a non-breather on him from the start, keep him nice and pre-oxygenated, and then I probably would have had a lesser concern for the airway. Another thing similar to RSI for procedural sedation is that idea of pre-treatment. So sometimes for RSI, we'll pre-treat with a push-dose pressor, and in procedural sedation, you can also pre-treat with Zofran, because a lot of the agents we give for sedation have the side effect of nausea and vomiting. And if they're sedated and start to vomit, that's not a good thing. Procedural sedation is, hopefully, you can sedate and manage their pain without having to take their airway. That is the ultimate goal, is you don't want to turn a patient into an RSI patient unless they have to. So yeah, what would I have done differently? What would I have done better? I would have pre-treated with Zofran, and I would have definitely pre-oxygenated him just as if I was going to RSI. So what does the NIH guidelines say on procedural sedation? Now, a lot of you probably hear 1.5 mg per kg as a total dose and go, whoa, that is really high if you're not going to be taking his airway, right? Because the RSI dose is 1 to 2 mg per kg, and I gave him 1.5, so we're right in the middle of that RSI dose. Well, according to the NIH guidelines on procedural sedation, the dosing range for ketamine is an initial dose of 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram, so the same as the RSI dose, with an additional dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram every 5 to 10 minutes. When administered intramuscularly, the typical dose is 5 milligrams per kilogram, with repeat doses of 2 to 5 milligrams per kilogram if sedation is inadequate. So we're well within the NIH range for the guidelines for procedural sedation, so no worries there. What I would have done differently, and the NIH backs me up on this, is the treatment with something other than just ketamine. Something we can do to decrease the severity of an emergence reaction and the severity of that respiratory depression is to treat it with something different in addition to ketamine. So we see compounding effects when we use an opiate analgesic with a sedative analgesic like ketamine. So I would have started with a pre-treatment of like 50 micrograms of fentanyl or 100 micrograms of fentanyl to see how much I could control his pain with that. My reasoning for not doing that at the time was because I knew I needed to heavily manipulate this guy's broken legs so that he could fit onto a backboard and we could get him out of this deep hole that he had found himself in. So I went for the ketamine because I figured it covers the analgesic, the sedation, and the amnesia that I'm looking for. But if I had pre-treated with ketamine or with fentanyl, I probably could have avoided that 1.5 mg per kg dose of fentanyl and maybe just gone for a mg per kg or 0.75 mg per kg and received the same sedation effects that I was looking for without having to go so high and then without having such a bad emergence reaction. Another medication combination that is recommended by the NIH is fentanyl and Versed or midazolam together. You can use 50 to 100 micrograms. They say 1 microgram per kilogram, actually, of fentanyl, following it up with about 3.5 milligrams of Versed. They say usually a patient needs less than 3.5 milligrams of Versed. They say don't recommend going over 10 milligrams, administered 15 to 20 minutes before the procedure. So don't go over 10 milligrams. Usually it's about 3.5 milligrams. But what does that do? So the fentanyl provides the pain management and the Versed provides the sedation and the analgesic effects. I think personally that the Versed will provide better analgesic effects than the ketamine would. So if I had to do this scenario all over again with the knowledge I have now, I probably would pre-treat with fentanyl to require less ketamine, or I would switch my medication modalities entirely to a ketamine or a fentanyl and a Versed approach. Another thing they recommend, and this doesn't really apply to EMS as much, I know some services will carry it and some services have it in their drug list for transfers and such, but it's ketamine and propofol. It's known as ketofol and can mitigate some of the adverse effects of either propofol or ketamine. So propofol has a pretty drastic effect on blood pressure. And then ketamine, you have those laryngospasms, the nausea, the vomiting, and the potential for respiratory depression and emergence reaction. So they find that mostly propofol and ketamine together will reduce the emergence reactions while counteracting the hypotensive effects of the propofol. And you can find the dosing for that on the NIH guideline website linked in the show notes if you care to read more about that. And I'm not going to talk too much more about it because, again, it really doesn't apply to EMS so much as it does transfers or in the hospital. But yeah, that was kind of a rapid fire episode. Let me know if you guys have any other recommendations. And you could feel free to send me your listener questions on Instagram at MostlyStablePod. I will be sure to read those and get back to you as soon as possible. Well, that does it for today's episode. Go ahead and follow. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and like and subscribe, and then check out the Instagram, and have a great day.